Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The last known image of Sativa was taken inside a four-star resort room in Cancun, Mexico, on November 26, 2021. She's standing by a mirror, her hair pinned up, eyes faintly tired but smiling. The room behind her is well lit. A makeup bag rests on the counter, and behind her, a man's hoodie is thrown over the foot of the bed. She sent the photo to her sister just before midnight. 16 hours later, she was dead. At first glance, Sativa was another American tourist enjoying a holiday weekend abroad. She and her longtime boyfriend, Taylor Allen, had flown in from Milton, Washington on Thanksgiving Thursday. The trip wasn't unusual. The couple had traveled together before. Friends described Sativa as the kind of person who planned itineraries weeks in advance. Hotel packages, shuttle confirmations, TSA pre-check, even custom sunscreen bottles. The kind of person who made chaos inconvenient. But the messages she sent back home that Friday night were not casual travel updates. Screenshots later reviewed by authorities showed a text to a friend in all lowercase. "He got mad again, through my phone. I'm okay though. Just needed a couple stitches." The message was sent at 10:36 p.m. The couple stitches she referred to were real. According to a local clinic near the Zona Hotelera, a female foreigner had arrived with a superficial head wound. The attending nurse later recalled that the woman seemed more anxious than hurt. She wasn't alone. A man was pacing the hallway outside the triage room, audibly frustrated. The staff remembered the couple because she paid in pesos while he stood without speaking. Back in Washington, Sativa's sister began to worry. Their family text thread, normally active during holidays, had gone silent. Calls went to voicemail. When the hotel front desk was finally reached on Saturday morning, the answer was short. "We're aware of an incident. Hotel room 419, second floor. The door was locked from the inside when security arrived." Taylor Allen opened the door after a brief delay. His shirt was wrinkled, the left sleeve torn. When asked about the woman in the room, he said only, "She's not breathing." He did not initiate CPR. He did not request emergency assistance. By the time the paramedics arrived, rigor mortis had begun. Initial assessment by Mexican law enforcement indicated no forced entry, no signs of third-party involvement, and no weapons on site. There were bruises on the victim's arms and torso, a contusion above her left eyebrow, and lacerations to the scalp. The bathroom mirror was cracked. Her passport and phone had been placed in the hotel room safe. The lock had been reset from the inside at 1:13 a.m. using Taylor Allen's swipe card. This detail would later become pivotal. Hotel staff recalled Taylor appearing agitated the previous evening. Security logs showed he had exited the room multiple times between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. Surveillance footage confirmed that he had approached the front desk twice, though he never spoke to staff. He stood in the hallway for minutes at a time, occasionally glancing at his phone, which forensic logs would later confirm was wiped of several messaging apps by sunrise. In towns like Milton, Washington, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Sativa had no enemies. She wasn't involved in criminal activity. Her online presence was spotless. She lived alone, worked a full-time job, and sent her mom photos of her dog in a pumpkin sweater. Nothing about her profile suggested risk. But as one investigator noted privately, victimology isn't about the wrong place at the wrong time. It's about the patterns we fail to see in time. When local police from Washington state were notified of Sativa's death by the U.S. consulate on Saturday, they launched a standard contact and support protocol. Within 24 hours, FBI legal attaché in Mexico City had flagged the case as potentially subject to binational review. That same weekend, Taylor Allen was detained by Mexican authorities for suspicious circumstances surrounding a foreign national death. The autopsy would be delayed until Monday. By Monday morning, the U.S. media had caught wind of the story. The phrase Cancun death mystery appeared in several headlines, though few included more than a couple of paragraphs. A young woman dead on vacation was disturbing, but not yet suspicious enough for a full cycle. After all, alcohol poisoning, accidental drowning, or heat stroke were frequent culprits in tourist zones. But the Transu family knew better. They had screenshots. They had the timestamps. They had the final messages, and they didn't add up. One of them read, "He broke my phone again." That message had never been opened. The FBI quietly reached out to Mexican authorities. A detective on the Cancun case, a veteran investigator named Ana Lucia Hernandez, recalled thinking that something about the physical scene was too staged. There was no struggle in the common area, no dishes overturned, and yet the victim had suffered internal injuries inconsistent with a fall. Hernandez requested toxicology, biometric scans from the smart lock, and hotel-wide security logs. What she got instead was a clean digital trail. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. At 8:47 a.m. local time, a team of municipal officers entered room 419 with authorization from the Cancun Policía Ministerial. The scene had already been partially disturbed. A hotel staff member had moved a towel near the foot of the bed, and one paramedic had unsuccessfully attempted to assess the body before stepping back, citing lack of clear signs of life. What remained, however, was enough to begin staging the forensic baseline. The first irregularity was the mirror. A vertical crack split the vanity mirror in the bathroom. The glass had not shattered outward or buckled from heat. It had been fractured by impact. Glass technicians later confirmed that the break was consistent with a blunt force striking a fixed surface at head level. Measurements showed that the crack aligned with a standing adult between 5'6" and 5'8". Sativa Transu was 5'7". There was no blood on the mirror itself, but a tissue sample on the corner of the sink, partially wet, wrapped into a tight ball, tested positive for type O blood, consistent with the victim's. The second anomaly was the positioning of the body. The victim was found on the right side of the bed, in a semi-lateral position, with legs slightly curled and arms relaxed, as if asleep. But rigor mortis indicated otherwise. Estimated time of death was between 2 and 3 a.m., based on core temperature and degree of rigidity. By the time authorities entered, the body had been dead for at least 5 hours. There were no visible signs of recent CPR attempts, no chest compression bruising, no displacement of the rib cage, no signs of airway obstruction cleared. The bedding showed signs of disturbance, but not in the way one might expect after a fatal altercation. There were pressure indentations on the left side of the bed, suggesting someone had remained seated for an extended time post-mortem. These impressions were documented and logged. One investigator would later note in their internal memo, "Post-incident behavior suggests attempted staging or non-intervention during decline." Authorities also recovered 2 phones from the hotel room. One belonged to the victim, an iPhone 11, locked with a 4-digit passcode and linked to a cloud account. The other, a Samsung device, was owned by the male occupant. The iPhone had not been used since 11:12 p.m. the night before. Its most recent unlocked session showed a browser history for a local clinic and a search for "how to stop bleeding without stitches." That search was time-stamped at 9:59 p.m. The Samsung phone had been factory reset. A log from the hotel Wi-Fi router confirmed that device MAC address 78.9A C4XXX11 connected to the hotel network at 1:37 a.m. and disconnected at 5:12 a.m. The reset occurred at approximately 3:08 a.m., 2 hours after the estimated time of death. When asked by authorities why he reset his phone, the male guest replied, "It froze and wouldn't work. I was panicking." The response was logged but not challenged at that time. There were no signs of forced deletion via third-party software, but cloud backups for both devices were requested via legal liaison through the U.S. Embassy. This would take days. In the meantime, investigators turned to the physical space. Room 419 had 2 empty water bottles, an overturned chair near the balcony, and a broken plastic frame from the minibar inventory chart. The front lock, as confirmed in Chapter 1, had been accessed 5 times between 11:10 p.m. and 2:14 a.m., all by the male occupant's swipe card. No other key cards were registered. A fingerprint technician lifted several prints from the bathroom counter and mirror. All prints matched either the victim or the male guest. However, one set of partial prints on the inside of the closet door belonged to neither, eventually matched to a housekeeper who had cleaned the room earlier that afternoon. No forensic anomalies were found there. The most conclusive forensic detail came from a single piece of evidence retrieved from the trash bin. A receipt from the urgent care clinic showed that Sativa had visited the facility on the evening of November 26 at approximately 8:41 p.m. She was treated for a scalp wound measuring 2.3 cm, closed with surgical adhesive. She signed the release form herself. The staff reported no visible impairment or signs of alcohol, but noted that the female patient appeared highly anxious and refused to discuss the origin of injury. Back in the room, a light smear of blood was located beneath the bathroom sink cabinet, a transfer mark, not a pooling stain. Blood spatter analysts later concluded the pattern was consistent with vertical drip from laceration while leaning forward. In plain terms, she had been bleeding while tending to herself at the sink, likely after the mirror incident. Forensic sequencing now showed this timeline. 8:41 p.m., clinic visit for head wound. 9:59 p.m., phone search, how to stop bleeding. 10:36 p.m., text sent to friend, I'm okay though, just needed a couple stitches. 11:12 p.m., last known phone usage by victim, 1:13 a.m. Final door lock access 2, October 3, work a.m. Estimated time of death, 3:08 a.m. Factory reset of male guest phone, 8:47 a.m. Room access by police. It was a quiet hotel corridor. The walls were insulated. No other guests on the floor reported hearing raised voices or suspicious noises. The hotel had no internal cameras in the hallways, only at elevators and public spaces. And the footage that did exist showed only one person entering and exiting room 419 that night. Still, no murder weapon had been found. No witness had reported physical assault. And the man in the room insisted it had been an accident. But injuries that result from accidental falls do not include bruising around the upper throat. They do not create fracture patterns behind the ears. They do not include subconjunctival hemorrhages, tiny blood vessels in the eyes that burst under pressure. Those are signs of strangulation. The forensic image of Sativa's iPhone was completed 72 hours after the scene had been cleared. The device, preserved under chain of custody, revealed a cloud sync log with a 4-hour gap on the night of November 26, 2021. Investigators didn't need to guess why. What mattered was what survived in the backup. The data recovered wasn't a confession. It didn't show footage, didn't record audio, and didn't include a final plea for help. What it showed was more mundane and more telling. Between 5:43 p.m. and 11:12 p.m., the night Sativa died, her phone had received 31 messages. Most were from friends responding to earlier texts where she mentioned needing a couple stitches and that it was just a misunderstanding. A few included variations of, "Are you safe? Do you need help?" And one that simply read, "Call me when he's asleep." None were answered. The last message she sent was time-stamped 10:36 p.m. It was short. "All good, I'll be offline. Talk TMRW." But metadata showed that she opened that thread 3 times in the next 20 minutes. She didn't reply. No screenshots were taken. No calls were made. Instead, the phone's Notes app was opened at 10:49 p.m. A new entry titled Stuff to Fix Later was created. It contained only 3 lines. Cancel app to change locks, check storage unit. It was saved at 10:52 p.m. and never reopened. Forensic specialists flagged 2 deleted photo sets stored in the recently deleted folder. The first was a photo of her stitched forehead, likely taken at the clinic earlier that evening. The second set, time-stamped just past 9:01 p.m., showed an image of the cracked bathroom mirror and a close-up of blood-streaked fingers. Both were manually deleted after 11 p.m. Neither had been posted to social media or sent through messaging apps. The deletion logs were linked to manual user actions, not system crashes. The swipe pattern to unlock the phone did not match the victim's usual rhythm. Behavioral analytics, while not definitive evidence, suggested the phone may have been accessed by someone else during that final hour. Investigators cross-referenced Wi-Fi logins and determined the device remained connected to the hotel's network until it was powered off at approximately 1:26 a.m. That time, notably, did not align with any usage pattern from Sativa's prior nights in the room. Her usual phone shutdown time, per sleep app data, was between midnight and 12:30 a.m. More concerning was the backup delay. Sativa's iCloud account was set to sync every 6 hours. The next scheduled sync after 11 p.m. should have occurred at 5 a.m. It didn't. The reason was straightforward. The phone had been turned off before that window, and the Wi-Fi had been manually disabled prior to power down. That required deliberate access to settings. This, paired with the device's inactivity and reset on the companion Samsung phone in the room, formed the foundation of the digital tampering suspicion. Meanwhile, the FBI legal attaché's office in Mexico processed an emergency subpoena for Google account metadata tied to Taylor Allen's devices. What they found created a new complication: a silent location trail. At 3:07 a.m., a registered Google account, assigned to Allen's name, sent an automated location ping from the hotel room. That data point placed his phone on the room's balcony, 17 feet from where the victim's body lay inside. The ping only lasted 14 seconds. Location services were disabled directly afterward. No call to 911 was ever placed. Back in Washington, detectives began a parallel investigation into the months preceding the trip. The family had submitted a collection of printed texts and screenshots from previous years, many concerning, none conclusive. But with consent from Sativa's sister and approval from the Digital Crimes Unit, law enforcement retrieved a series of backup drives and cloud-stored exports that painted a deeper behavioral picture. Over the previous 10 months, there had been 5 breaks in contact between Sativa and her social circle, each spanning 2 to 3 weeks. During those periods, she ceased posting to social media, declined group invitations, and turned off read receipts. Each time she returned with casual explanations. "Work's been crazy. I'm detoxing from the internet," or "just needed a break." But in her cloud-synced calendar, 3 of those silent periods coincided with out-of-town trips logged under generic titles like Weekend Reset or Quiet Retreat. All 3 showed joint lodging bookings with Taylor Allen. Investigators noted a pattern: prolonged isolation, emotional withdrawal, suppression of external communication, and abrupt return with vague positivity. No police reports were filed during those intervals. No visible injuries were documented. But behavioral forensicists, reviewing her phone data and message tone, classified it as coercive emotional containment, a phrase denoting psychological manipulation that doesn't leave bruises, but leaves a trail in data. Her final backup included a note from September, titled "What I'd Take If I Go." It listed items, laptop, birth certificate, 2 books, and my own toothbrush. A timestamp showed it was created at 2:08 a.m. There was no indication she ever packed. One additional device was retrieved from her home in Washington during a courtesy check-in. It was an old iPad she rarely used, still logged into her primary account. On it was a draft email in her outbox. It was never sent. The subject line read, "In case I chicken out." The message read, "I'm sorry I haven't told anyone. I don't know how to say it without making him sound like a monster. But I'm scared. I think if I go, he'll come after me. Or worse, he'll say it's my fault again. I don't know what to do." The email had been last edited 5 days before she died. By the 4th day of the investigation, Mexican authorities had begun to draw sharper lines between witness statements and verifiable data. The forensic groundwork from room 419 was already in motion, and the digital extraction from Sativa's iPhone had started revealing gaps. Gaps that only made sense when layered against behavioral inconsistencies. But the next breakthrough didn't come from a hard drive or a swipe card. It came from a nurse. The private urgent care clinic that treated Sativa on the evening of November 26, 2021, had logged her visit at 8:41 p.m. According to the intake form, the patient arrived with a head laceration just under 2.5 centimeters long and requested adhesive closure instead of stitches. She paid in cash. No insurance was used. No mention of assault or accident was made. The attending nurse recorded that the patient appeared anxious, declined pain medication, and avoided eye contact. Normally, a brief entry like that wouldn't raise red flags. Tourists often get minor injuries, but the signature on the clinic release form didn't match the victim's handwriting in official documents. A handwriting analyst from the FBI's Quantico division later confirmed that the pressure pattern and letter slope differed from verified samples provided by Sativa's employer and passport records. That alone wouldn't hold in court, but it forced a reevaluation of who filled out the form. Security footage from the clinic, finally obtained through consular coordination, showed Sativa entering the facility alone. She kept her head down. Her left hand clutched a piece of paper towel pressed to her temple. Behind her, a man lingered in the reception area for less than 2 minutes, then walked back outside without approaching staff. That man was identified as Taylor Allen through matching clothing seen in hotel surveillance earlier that evening. The footage time-stamped her clinic departure at 9:03 p.m. That left a nearly 90-minute window before the last confirmed message from her phone was sent. And based on backup logs, she did not text during or immediately after the visit. The investigative team began reconstructing those 90 minutes. The hotel room keycard showed 3 re-entries between 9:12 p.m. and 10:45 p.m. Each was done using the same access credential registered to the male guest. No second guest key was issued. There was no food delivery or housekeeping activity during that period. According to internal hotel logs, room service was declined. The evidence didn't point toward a sudden explosion of violence, but it did point to a controlled environment where digital activity dropped sharply, physical evidence of injury mounted, and communication became selective. Investigators described it as containment escalation, a slow, deliberate tightening of the victim's ability to move, speak, or seek help. Back in Washington, the FBI field office in Seattle initiated interviews with Sativa's coworkers and inner circle. A pattern emerged in their statements. She minimized prior incidents, never filed a formal complaint, and often reassured people that he didn't mean it. But one friend recalled a phone call 3 weeks before the trip. According to her sworn statement, Sativa said, "I think I'll use this vacation to figure everything out. If it goes well, maybe things can still change." That statement was corroborated by a calendar entry labeled Reset, scheduled for December 2nd, 4 days after she was supposed to return from Cancun. Investigators also recovered a draft document from her cloud account labeled Lease Transfer. It contained her name, a partial Washington address, and an unsigned date field. Created November 10th, last modified November 20th. The clinic visit became more than a side detail. It was the only moment Sativa was physically away from Taylor in public, with access to professionals, yet no report was made. Some would later criticize the medical staff for not probing further. But under Mexican law, unless a patient discloses assault or is visibly unconscious, the incident isn't escalated to police. She never spoke a word about how it happened, but she did write something. In her phone's Notes app, a file named If Asked included only this: "Slip near the balcony, hit the edge of the mirror." That explanation didn't align with the injury angle documented by clinic staff or with the force required to crack tempered glass. A fall that clean would have caused lower body impact first. The bruising pattern showed otherwise. She'd likely been upright when her head hit the mirror, and she likely hadn't slipped. In criminal investigations involving intimate partners, escalation rarely begins with a single act. It's cumulative, documented not by what's reported, but by what's repeated and dismissed. And by the 5th day of reviewing evidence in the death of Sativa Transu, that pattern had become undeniable. The suspect, who, at this point in the timeline, had not yet been formally charged, remained in Mexican custody under preventive detention. No confession had been offered. No weapon had been found. But forensic and behavioral indicators had begun forming a profile not of a spontaneous tragedy, but of sustained control. Back in Washington, the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit examined more than 700 text messages exchanged between Sativa and the man she had dated for nearly 3 years. The review focused on tone shifts, keyword patterns, and passive-aggressive cycles. The findings revealed a consistent psychological pattern: monitoring disguised as concern, isolation disguised as intimacy, and outbursts that ended with scripted apologies. In one thread after an argument, he wrote, "I just need you to understand how much I worry when you don't check in." Within minutes, she replied, "Sorry, my phone died." Over time, her responses got shorter. She stopped using emojis. Messages that once included updates about friends or coworkers became focused solely on him, not by request, but by consequence. The BAU report concluded that the relationship had been characterized by coercive behavior with intermittent reinforcement, a hallmark of emotional containment. Sativa had not filed any domestic violence complaints. There were no restraining orders, but the change in her digital communication showed a retreat from autonomy. And when emotional distance wasn't enough, physical isolation followed. According to her phone's location logs in the 2 months leading up to the Mexico trip, Sativa had spent over 85% of her non-work hours at home. She declined 5 consecutive friend invitations and removed herself from 2 group chats. Her sleep tracking app showed a decline in regularity and an increase in late-night device activity. The Cancun trip had been framed, even to her close friends, as a reset, but the forensic data now suggested it was a containment trip, a familiar tactic in domestic coercion cases, used to limit outside influence and increase dependency. Meanwhile, forensic pathologists completed their preliminary report. In addition to scalp trauma, the autopsy identified deep tissue bruising on the upper arms and left side of the chest, consistent with blunt force compression. The injuries were not fresh, some had occurred days before. This undermined any claim of a single incident fall. The ligature bruising at the neck, originally suspected but unconfirmed, was not prominent enough to label as strangulation in isolation. But investigators noted the presence of petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, a secondary indicator of restricted airflow under pressure. Taken together with the broken mirror, digital silence, and pattern of isolation, a broader picture formed. It wasn't just about the moment of death. It was about the loss of agency leading up to it. The psychological profile of the suspect leaned toward dominance behavior. A former roommate of the suspect, located in Tacoma, gave a statement about controlling behavior he had witnessed over a year prior. According to him, arguments about social media privacy and jealousy had been common in the couple's early relationship. He recalled one night when Sativa had slept in the living room after a fight. No violence had been witnessed, but she was always trying to keep the peace. The roommate's account matched the thematic profile investigators were building. Someone who exerted control not through threats, but by wearing down boundaries until compliance felt like consent. There's a reason why prosecutors in domestic homicide cases rely heavily on pre-incident behavior. It's not about building motive in the traditional sense. It's about establishing a pattern that proves control was intentional, not incidental. And at this stage, even without a direct witness to the night of November 26th, the control was starting to speak for itself. On December 1st, 2021, 5 days after Sativa Transu was found dead in a Cancun resort room, Mexican prosecutors filed formal charges against the man detained at the scene. The charge was not homicide. It was feminicidio, a legal classification that, under Mexican law, identifies the murder of a woman committed with elements of control, violence, and gender-based intent. This wasn't symbolic. It had legal implications. In Mexico, femicide carries enhanced sentencing guidelines and shifts the burden of narrative. It requires investigators to demonstrate not just that the victim was killed, but that she was killed because she was a woman, in a context of systemic or intimate partner violence. The charge followed mounting evidence. At that point, investigators had a full autopsy report, injury pattern analysis, swipe card and phone metadata, and behavioral history suggesting long-term coercion. But the most compelling piece for prosecutors wasn't technological, it was procedural, the absence of any other explanation. There was no forced entry, no medical emergency, no defensive wounds on the suspect, no alcohol levels in the victim suggesting self-harm or accident, and no timeline that supported an alternate theory. Every log, timestamp, and location ping led back to one person in one room with one locked door. The U.S. State Department was notified immediately. Legal attachés coordinated with Mexican authorities to ensure due process, while also confirming that the suspect was a U.S. citizen in custody under local jurisdiction. The consulate offered logistical support, but could not interfere with the prosecution. Within 48 hours of the charge being filed, the media narrative began shifting. The phrase "suspicious death" disappeared from headlines. It was replaced with "suspected femicide." Public interest surged. True crime forums picked up the story, but beneath that attention, the investigation remained procedural, cold, focused on outcome, not opinion. The forensic team returned to the hotel room for a secondary inspection, prompted by inconsistencies in statements given by the suspect during early questioning. He had initially claimed that Sativa had gone to sleep after their argument, and that he discovered her unresponsive several hours later. But revised timelines now indicated he was awake during the critical window of 1 to 3 hours a.m. His phone, reset at 3:08 a.m., had connected to the hotel Wi-Fi moments before, suggesting manual access, not passive inactivity. No call to emergency services was made from the room. No attempt at CPR was documented. The autopsy confirmed signs of prolonged compression, not instantaneous trauma. The fracture in the bathroom mirror, the bruising on both forearms, and the internal bleeding in her chest cavity told a single story. Force had been applied in more than one location. At the hearing to confirm detention, Mexican prosecutors submitted their preliminary case file. The court agreed with the probable cause finding and approved pretrial incarceration without bond. This was standard procedure in femicide cases where the suspect poses a flight risk and evidence supports intent. The suspect's legal team offered no rebuttal at the hearing. No plea was entered. He remained silent. Back in Washington, Sativa's family released a written statement thanking both U.S. and Mexican authorities. They also acknowledged the difficulty of pursuing justice across borders, especially in a system that wasn't their own. But the message was clear. They supported the charge. Forensic sequencing had now shifted from discovery to confirmation. Prosecutors moved to preserve all digital records, cloud backups, SMS transcripts, time-stamped app logs, as formal exhibits. Surveillance footage from the hotel elevator, previously peripheral, was re-reviewed. It showed the suspect returning to room 419 at 12:44 a.m., visibly agitated, pacing with clenched fists. That was the last movement recorded before the time of death estimate. For investigators, the case no longer revolved around mystery. It centered on accountability. By the second week of December 2021, Sativa Transu's name had moved beyond police files and case logs. Her story was now a headline. Not because her case was solved, it wasn't. Not because her killer had confessed, he hadn't, but because the details had reached the public with enough clarity to provoke a collective reckoning. It wasn't just a domestic homicide abroad. It was a pattern that had become visible too late. In the days following the femicide charge, journalists began tracing Sativa's online presence. Archived posts from a year earlier showed a vibrant young woman, smiling in national parks, posing with coworkers at company events, planning vacations with friends. In contrast, the last 6 months revealed a shift. Reduced activity, no tagged photos, minimal interaction. She hadn't disappeared from view. She had been receding slowly, quietly, and no one had asked why until it was too late. Federal data from the United States Department of Justice shows that intimate partner homicide remains one of the most underreported and least prevented forms of violence, particularly among young adults without children or shared finances. Demographics that tend to fall between intervention thresholds. Sativa, 26, fit this category exactly. No criminal history, no restraining orders, no police contact. She had every outward sign of being fine, except for the digital silences, the canceled plans, and the note left unsent. Back in Cancun, the case continued to move. Mexican prosecutors, supported by forensic reports from 2 separate laboratories, submitted their formal indictment. The key findings included 1 confirmed head trauma from a fixed surface impact, 3 distinct compression injuries on the upper body, and a timeline of digital inactivity consistent with an estimated time of death between 2 and 3 a.m. There were no competing theories offered. The suspect's attorney filed no motion to dismiss, nor requested bail. The pretrial detention order stood. A trial was likely months away, but the shape of the prosecution was set. Gender-based violence, sustained pattern of coercion, opportunity without interference. Meanwhile, U.S. investigators began their own internal debrief. Though not tasked with prosecution, they reviewed timelines and device data to evaluate whether any prior intervention had been possible. The answer was complicated. There had been warning signs but no statutory violations. No clear moment where intervention would have been legally warranted. One FBI analyst noted in their internal memo, "We observed progressive social disconnection, abrupt behavioral change, and suppressed communication, all indicative of emotional containment. But without direct disclosure, the indicators remain post-event in nature." In other words, the system only saw clearly once it had already failed. It wasn't the first time. A parallel review by domestic violence prevention experts found that Sativa's digital patterns, decreasing engagement, withdrawal from group settings, vague statements about being tired or needing space, mirrored dozens of other victims in similar cases. The tools to detect such changes exist, but they're reactive, not preventative. No alert triggers when someone stops answering group texts. No warning gets issued when someone untags themselves from photos. The tragedy is that most victims don't vanish in one moment. They fade, and the fading gets explained away. By them, by us, by a culture uncomfortable with pressing too hard into private lives. Sativa didn't write a final message identifying her killer. She didn't leave a voice memo or record a confrontation, but she left fragments, search histories, unfinished notes, and a pattern that investigators were able to reconstruct with painful precision. In the end, it was enough for a legal case, but it wasn't enough to prevent her death. By early 2022, the public had stopped calling it a tragedy and started calling it what it was, a femicide. Not a crime of passion, not a vacation gone wrong, not an unfortunate accident. It was a preventable death, the endpoint of a pattern that no one interrupted in time. But as the story gained traction across national media in the U.S., one uncomfortable fact remained. There was no verdict. Taylor Allen, the man who had traveled to Cancun with Sativa Transu for what was supposed to be a Thanksgiving getaway, remained in custody in Mexico. As of June 2025, he has not stood trial, he has not entered a plea, and he has not publicly spoken about the night Sativa died. This is not unusual. The Mexican judicial system allows for extended pretrial detention under certain violent crime statutes, particularly when the crime involves foreign nationals or gender-based homicide. In Allen's case, prosecutors submitted sufficient evidence to classify the death as feminicidio under Article 325 of the Mexican Federal Penal Code. This alone permitted indefinite detention pending trial, especially given the risk of flight and the weight of forensic material presented. Legal observers have noted the strength of the case file. The data trail, spanning geolocation pings, app deletions, clinic security footage, and behavioral records, formed a timeline with no plausible alternative explanation. Sativa was last seen injured and anxious. She returned to a locked hotel room. She died with multiple internal injuries. No one else entered, and her devices went silent. No emergency call was made. The phone of the man in the room was factory reset by sunrise. What remains unresolved is not what happened. That part is functionally established. What remains is the formal legal process, one slowed by international protocol, language barriers, COVID-era court backlogs, and a judicial system structured differently than the one Americans might expect. And yet in this case, silence from the courtroom has not meant silence from the people who knew her. Sativa's family, devastated by her loss, took swift action to channel their grief into prevention. They founded a nonprofit under her name, Sativa's Voice, which now works with young women and educators to identify early behavioral signs of coercive relationships. The program doesn't teach people how to leave. It teaches them how to see, to recognize withdrawal patterns, shifting baselines, the erosion of independence that often hides behind concern or love. Because the truth is, Sativa didn't just vanish one night. She was receding long before her final photo. Investigators who worked the case still refer to it during forensic training modules, particularly in digital behavior analysis. The pattern of minimized communication, self-isolation, cloud-based notes written but never sent, these aren't just personal details. They're case signals, now used to build digital victimology profiles and other investigations. Her silence has, paradoxically, become data. And in the hands of trained professionals, that data may yet save someone else. The FBI closed its auxiliary investigation in 2023 after formally reviewing all evidence collected in coordination with Mexican authorities. No federal charges were filed in the U.S., given jurisdictional limits. However, their behavioral report remains sealed and stored in the BAU archive, categorized under non-court admitted high-risk control cases. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the case against Taylor Allen remains active, with trial proceedings expected but not publicly scheduled. His legal representation has not issued further comment since the detention hearing. The only consistent update is that he remains incarcerated, awaiting formal proceedings for a charge that carries a possible 40-year sentence. Justice, in its procedural form, moves slowly. But the evidence doesn't go away. Neither does the memory. And the longer the silence from courtrooms, the louder the question becomes for all of us. Why do we so often wait until it's over to believe someone was in danger? It's not always screaming. It's not always bruises. Sometimes it's a quiet calendar entry, a deleted photo, a search for how to leave someone safely. Sometimes it's just a name that goes unspoken for too long. And in the absence of a verdict, in the gap left by what was never said, what remains is still enough. Her name was Sativa. Her story didn't end in that room. It ended in a system that didn't intervene in time, but now carries her as a lesson, a pattern, and a name that means something more than another file closed too late. Sometimes the warning signs are barely visible until they've already become a crime scene. I've told you this story not just to recount what happened, but to remind you that silence is never neutral. If you're in a situation where control feels like love or distance feels like safety, pay attention. If someone around you is slowly disappearing, ask questions, gently but persistently. We don't always get second chances to listen. If this story moved you or made you reflect, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what would you say to someone who might be quietly asking for help? If you found value in this video, whether it informed you, helped you, or simply stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real stories that matter. And if it didn't resonate with you, I still want to hear why. Let's keep the conversation honest, human, and connected. Stay aware, stay kind, stay alive.